COVID situation and everything. And obviously we're living in weird times and stuff, but we're really happy that we're able to connect with everyone, see everybody's faces, at least, virtually for a little bit, and talk through some of the issues IEC is continuing to work on with our partners. And if any of you are not IEC members and would like to hear more about like what we're doing and support us and stuff, we definitely encourage you guys to join, and we'll be posting some info in the chat about how you can do that. Today, as the invite had told everybody, we are going to be focusing on how the COVID-19 pandemic has really had a big impact on our food system. I'm preaching to the choir here with probably a lot of the folks that are in this room, but even before the coronavirus pandemic started, there were a lot of folks out there that realized that our food system and our food chain was not in good shape. Whether it was from the amount or the types of foods that people had access to, whether they even had access to food in the first place, the processing of these foods being centralized, and a number of other issues, especially around equity and inclusion in the food chain supply. So we've got a collection of really great experts here that are going to be helping us kind of dig through some of these issues. We've got 5 presenters for an hour. So we're going to do quick 10-minute like little bursts of information for folks. And we will go from there. Firstly, I'll introduce who we've got, and then I will start letting them do their presentations. Our first presenter will be Rodger Cooley, who is the Executive Director for the Chicago Food Policy Action Council. Next up, we'll have Liz Stelk, who is the Executive Director of the Illinois Stewardship Alliance. Thirdly, we will have Sean Ruane, did I pronounce that right? Close, who is the Executive Director of Advocates for Urban Agriculture. And fourth up, we will have Anton, who is the lead steward for Grow Greater Englewood. Excited to have him on. And lastly, we'll have Erika, who is the co-founder and CEO of operations for Urban Growers Collective. She's going to be a little bit late today because she had an emergency call with the mayor's office. Fun times in the food sector. So we'll see her in a little bit. But with that, I will go ahead and let Rodger kind of kick us off. Rodger, you have the ability to unmute yourself, right?
I believe so.
Awesome.
Great. Thanks for having us today. Really appreciative of the IEC team pulling together this topic and bringing together the broad group of folks, of members from across the state. So excited to be able to talk some about the food system and how COVID's been impacting some of our work, and also some of the larger responses that are happening. I'll go through this presentation very quickly. It's high level about some of the things that have been going on and some of the interruptions and some of the issues that it's highlighting within the current food system. I'm going to drop into the chat a resource that we've been working on. So one of the things we've been doing this spring is hoping to convene kind of a set of weekly calls on around COVID and the food system response to it, including producers, emergency food workers, food businesses, and then we do a weekly call on Fridays to kind of allow folks to check in about across all those different groups and starting to think through more collaborative responses on an emergency basis. And I just dropped in the chat a website where we've been collecting all the resources that we've been able to find around COVID, funding, a lot of pools of funding in different ways, different collaborative responses, different guidance around food safety issues, and also there's a lot of conversation about making sure getting PPE available for food workers, farmers, folks in the emergency food system as well, and then a lot of response around how to adjust and respond to all the changes in the emergency food system. Elliot, we can switch here. So, early on, there was a lot of news about the massive interruptions in the food system, and that the fact that lots of sectors are very siloed within the food system. So there's only one supply chain that this food was going to. So when institutions, restaurants, and other wholesale chains completely shut down, when demand immediately dried up, there was no way for the food system to adjust. It's very siloed. Again, the pathways move very quickly. So there ended up being a lot of waste because there isn't a lot of opportunities for quick transitions, for shifting focus. And thinking about how, and one of the things we've been thinking about, a lot of partners have been thinking about, is how to think about how things can pivot really rapidly. So there's not such rigidity in the market moving forward. But we can go on, but that, equaled in the million, again, lots and lots of food waste that just happened immediately because there wasn't that ability to transition. Elliot. So there's been this massive need in terms of emergency food access. I just saw the stat today that came out from the US Census household survey that Northwestern helps compile, that, in early spring, it looked like food stamps were actually, there's a big issue with the Trump administration looking at slashing and restricting food stamps for able-bodied adults. That was a big concern as we've been finally moving out and getting higher employment levels out of the last recession, and slashing some of those exemptions. But it looks like the data showing that food insecurity has tripled within 2 months in Illinois. And Illinois is not unique. It's kind of on the higher end within the country. But just that, and recognizing a lot of the folks who lost their work were part of the food system, that they were working at restaurants and retail, and they were immediately out of work and having to find and moving really rapidly into the emergency food system. And that's been a challenging response as well at the local level. One, how to help get local product into that mix, but also re-employing folks who had lost their jobs, and also making sure that there's healthy food that's getting the folks in communities who need it most. So there's a big overlap, and I'm sure Anton and Erika will talk about this too, that the food access and COVID is really hitting communities who already have, lots of health disparities and were at higher risk for getting COVID, and they're the ones who are at most need for getting healthier access, as well as getting back to work rapidly. So really seeing how these different parts and pieces of the food system can be thought through and come back together in new ways for getting healthier food to folks who need it most in these communities, while thinking about economic development issues in those communities as well. All right, Elliot. So also seeing that there's a lot of, there's a lot of bottlenecks within the food system. Food processing and meat packing is one of those. Again, these are also staffed by folks who have the least protections and worst conditions within the food system, and are some of the ones being most impacted by the meat processing as well. Also knowing that, these bottlenecks have also jumped the cost of meat and milk and produce dramatically in the last couple months, even as folks are out of work. So when there are things that said there isn't supply chain issues, there was a big article in the New York Times this morning about, even though pork processing was supposedly limited and prices were spiking, a lot of meat was moving to China. And so there's a lot of incongruities about how the larger food system is moving product through, and it's unclear about, what is about and most safe for communities, and making sure folks still can get affordable meat and protein while it being, environmentally produced. That there's just been, a lot of incongruities, that thinking about how the state and partners can start retransforming Illinois' agriculture. Right, Elliot? And just really highlighting that there's a lot of monopolies, or close to monopolies, in many parts of the food system at huge scales, and really starting to try to, and that is some of the reason why, there's these huge disruptions, because there are these massive pinch points, places where only the supply of food passes through very large but small numbers of spaces and processors and plants and distributors and then retailers. So when those things get disrupted, it's a very brittle system that's not prepared to be able to be adaptive, responsive, resilient to all these changes, while being fair to both ends of the market. Now then we can move on to the next one to leave space. but it's created some really interesting opportunities in demand and dynamic. So really reinforcing the need, and Sean is going to jump into this around making sure that local governments and municipalities are making sure that people can grow their food in safe ways, but also get the resources they need: access to land, access to water, access to safe soil. Again, also making sure that even as folks are thriving, like Janie's Mill, that food is able to get to folk in communities who need it most and are, clamoring for the highest quality food as well. It's not just going to the north side of Chicago for folks who are able to access and, afford weekly shares. Great that it's getting the support for those producers, but really making sure that equity is part of this conversation. That'll be the last one. So really thinking about some of the things ongoing, this is work that's been going on for years, but really highlighting that COVID is crystallizing the attention of these issues, has shown that how brittle the larger food system is, and really understanding that how this work can collaborate with the sustainability work of many of the organizations within IEC, and understand how there's collaborative opportunities within agriculture to really think about how it is dealing with environmental sustainability, but also community sustainability. So for sake of time, pass it on.
Hey, thank you, Rodger. Really appreciate that. There's some really, really interesting slides. But yeah, I think the next presenter we're going to have today is going to be Liz Stelk, Executive Director for Illinois Stewardship Alliance. Liz, whenever you're ready, you can kick us off.
Thanks, Elliot. Hi, everybody. Thanks so much for being here. I'm Liz Stelk, Executive Director of the Illinois Stewardship Alliance. And Rodger laid it out clear that COVID really highlighted the fragility of our food system. We sacrificed resiliency and food security for efficiency and scale, and we're paying the price for that, like decades of policy and economic choices that built our food system. And so we need to relocalize it. And doing so would also make us more climate resilient. So there's lots of reasons that we need to do that. And that's part of the Stewardship Alliance's mission. We're a statewide alliance of farmers and eaters who use their voices, like through organizing and advocacy, and our choices, like buying local and sustainable, to shape a more just and regenerative food system. We like to say that we're farmer-led and eater-powered. The good news about our food system is that in Illinois, we have hundreds of local food producers here that are a real foundation that we can build on to build a new food system that would give us actual real community food security. So I want to share a couple of stories. After the pandemic hit, the Alliance, we launched a phone banking effort to our local food producer members all over the state. We've talked to over 200 in the last few weeks. And I just want to share, a couple of stories. So like in Fairbury in Central Illinois, farmer Marty Travis, maybe many of you get food from down at the farm cooperative. He aggregates produce, meat, and cheese from 60 Central Illinois growers to sell to 40 farm-to-table chefs in Chicago. And in 1 week after the shelter in order placed, he told me that only 3 of those chefs were still open and ordering. Basically overnight, Marty pivoted to sell the direct families to Chicago, Peoria, and St. Joseph in Central Illinois through email. They had record sales well above their typical peak, which happens now in June. From what we're hearing, farms with CSA subscriptions and online ordering have been doing really well. And especially those who have delivery capacity. I see some heads nodding. I hope that's because you're all CSA members and you're getting your food from farmers. But at least 2 different farmers told us that they spent 12 hours in the car doing home delivery so that they could serve their customers. But they're eating all those labor and additional costs. And that's just not sustainable. Farmers with restaurant and wholesale customers who don't have direct market customers have been scrambling, especially those where it was really hard for them or more expensive to pivot to direct sales. This kind of matches what we were expecting. The Alliance is a member of the National Sustainable Agriculture Coalition, an NSAC producer report in March with economists that's expected to see a $600 million decline in sales and $100 million a total loss of a total loss in from local food of up to $1 billion from March through May 2020 if action wasn't taken to support local food producers and the local food system. So NSAC and a bunch of you probably took action when we asked members of Congress to get $9.5 billion for livestock producers, specialty crop, and local agriculture system. That was supposed to be money that would go to local food producers and farmers markets to adjust. And unfortunately, Secretary Perdue has not allowed any of that funding to go to local food sources, so we still have no federal support for local food. It's been really frustrating. There's also been huge backups in meat processing. So Rodger laid out that, 20-some thousand meat processing workers in this country are sick with COVID. We had, just in our organization alone, we had 2 board members who couldn't go to the farmer's market last weekend because they don't have any product to sell because they have a backup in local meat processing. So these are real challenges that are coming, we're experiencing right here. At the Alliance, we're trying to respond to this need. We got funding from the Chicago Region Food Systems Fund to establish a farmer resiliency fund to distribute grants to farmers who are selling local to make some of those capital investments on the farm. I know Advocates for Urban Agriculture also has a capacity building grant for farmers. So there's really an opportunity and a need for, especially the state, to step up and invest in local food security and keep the momentum of the demand for local food, but deal with the real challenges in the food system. So I wanted to share a couple other stories. We heard from Gorman Farm Fresh Produce in Moni a couple weeks ago. They had been, we'd been declared essential in the shelter order, but there's really been no clear guidance on operating with social distancing. In the meantime, the Illinois Farmers Market Association filled the void, but still, farmers markets have been basically operating on their own to try to figure out how to keep customers safe and coming back. For those farmers markets that have made changes to adapt to social distancing and remain open, they also haven't been able to provide a SNAP match, because if they have online ordering, unfortunately, SNAP cannot be taken online. So what we really need is for USDA to step up and allow for farmers markets to be able to accept SNAP online. And many farmers markets provide a match. There is one bit of good news from the state budget this year. The legislature passed the Healthy Local Food Incentives Fund with $500,000, $500,000 that's going to provide a dollar for dollar produce match in Illinois for people buying food on SNAP. So that's really great, except if your farmer's market only accepts pre-orders online. And the problem that won't go away is that farmers have struggled to really access PPE and face masks. Just in the last week, we've found that the state is finally loosening up some access to the stockpile. And farmers, I heard from Jody Osmond at Cedar Valley in Ottawa, who was picking up pork from his small meat processor, and he was really horrified when he saw that the young men working there, no one was social distancing and they didn't have face masks. They weren't, so he's worried for his farm and his customers if his small meat packer, if those guys get sick. So there's real threats. I want to talk a little just quickly about solutions. So there's definitely challenges ahead, but one of the biggest is sustaining the interest and the excitement in local food. So if you haven't seen it already, one resource we're hoping to become the definitive resource for finding local food is buyfreshbuylocalillinois.org. I'm going to throw that in the chat. Many organizations, almost all the organizations on this call, are working together to make this resource available for you to be able to find and buy local food. But that of course, buying is not enough. We need policy change and structure change. So one of the things that we think we really need is a food security plan. 18 other states have a climate adaptation plan that includes agriculture, and we think that could be a model for Illinois to really build both our climate resilience but also our food security. About 95% of all of our food is imported from other states when we have millions of acres of agriculture here. Also, we could shift procurement. So SIFPAC has done an incredible job of passing the good food purchasing policy in Chicago and in Cook County. That would move our public procurement list, so like state agencies, schools that buy food, colleges, and it would move it towards sources that are local, healthy, humane, sustainable, and fair. And if we had those values in the billions that we spend in food, we'd build a better food system. And there's a lot of solutions out there around meat packing, the bottlenecks in meat processing that are hindering farmers. So some states have used CARES Act funding for investments in meat processing. There's also ideas in Congress like the PRIME Act, which would allow processors to sell direct. And then there's one of the biggest challenges in food is the concentration of the very few companies that control all of food. And so a couple weeks ago, the attorneys general for 11 Midwestern states urged the Department of Justice to pursue a federal investigation into meat packers. And there's legislation in Congress to put a moratorium on new mergers in food. So those are some of the really big ideas that would help change the food system. I'm almost at time, so I'm going to leave it with this thought. This is really a moment. One, I think that the local food world has maybe waited for. You know, I hate to say, it pains me to say that it's the silver lining of the pandemic is the demand for local food, but this is really a movement moment, and we have an opportunity to feed people right here. But we really need leadership in order to make plans to make these things happen. So one of the things that you can do besides buying local is support and join the organizations that are on this call, including the Illinois Stewardship Alliance and others. So I'm going to just chat a link to our organization, and that's my time.
Liz, thank you so much. Very, very good. Give me just one second. Okay, cool. Well, I believe with that, we are going to go on to Sean with Advocates for Urban Agriculture. Sean, are you ready to go for us?
Ready to go.
Awesome, good deal. Well, I'm doing this spotlight video thing in Zoom. I've never done before, but I'm going to make you the star for this one.
Okay, so. Wow, that's a lot of pressure. Hey everyone. Yeah, I'm really grateful to be a part of this conversation, and thanks for joining, and thanks to IEC for the opportunity to be a part of it. And thanks to Rodger and Liz for really highlighting, I think, the challenges that have emerged within our food system as a result of the pandemic, and also, right, the hope and the opportunities that exist within our food system now because of some of these challenges. I would really echo what Liz just said at the end there about, right, like, though this has been an incredibly challenging time for us and our food system has been disrupted in so many ways, I think we're already seeing that out of this are emerging a number of new collaborations, new ideas around what our food system is, going to look like, really centering our values and making sure that our food system aligns with the values that we want to see in our world. So excited to be a part of conversations like this and to do this work. As Elliot said, my name is Sean Ruane. I'm the Executive Director of Advocates for Urban Agriculture, and we're a coalition of urban farms, community and school gardens, individuals and businesses working to support and expand sustainable agriculture in the Chicago region. So our mission is really to empower urban growers to foster thriving communities through the work that they do. And so we see ourselves as a network builder, as an organization that provides resources and training, and that works really proactively to empower local growers, whether it's the urban farmer, the community gardener, or the individual practitioner to build out a more sustainable food system for all of us. So, over the last few months, I've been really inspired by the resilience of local farmers and gardeners, right? Just in the Chicagoland area, and their ability to adapt and implement new market channels and new models of sales, right? I've seen a number of growers adapt to a CSA model. I've seen a number of new collaborations, farms and gardens working together to work with food pantries to provide emergency food relief. And so I think those are just small examples of the resilience that we're seeing throughout all of the organizations represented here today, and then in our larger food system as a whole. In the work that we do at AUA, I think Rodger and Liz did a really great job of highlighting a lot of the larger issues within our food system. We're a lot more narrowly focused. We're focused much just on really the urban context. So in terms of what I'm going to talk about today, envisioning our new food system, it's going to be a little bit more hyper-focused on the urban context. So I think for us, there are really three things that we hope to see come out of this in terms of developments within our food system. And these are three things that we have been and will continue to be working on to make this happen. So I think the first piece is just advancing policies within the city level that support urban agriculture and allow it to thrive. As all of you know, right, as Liz and Rodger were both just touching on, the demand for local food has skyrocketed, and that's been in many ways, a very exciting thing, particularly in the Chicago context. What some of you may not know is that while local farms' demand for CSA shares and other avenues to access their produce was skyrocketing, many of those growers didn't even have access to water to grow their food. And that's still actually a present issue, and that's something that we've been really actively working on over the last few weeks in coalition with Chicago Food Policy Action Council, ISA, Grow Greater Englewood, everyone that's represented on the call here today. At a baseline level, equitable and affordable water access for farms and gardens and land access as well are things that we really hope, as the demand for local food increases and as people want to see local food producers being empowered, that the city is willing to work with organizations like us to make sure that those policies align with those values. We've taken some positive steps forward over the last few weeks, and we hope that trend continues to happen. The other piece of that is land access. In Chicago, there is a lot of vacant land all over the city. And yet, if you talk to any urban farmer or even community gardener who's trying to grow food for their community, who has the support of their community, wants to keep it local, all of them are struggling to find land. And even if they do find land, it feels very unstable, the ground in which they're operating on. There's been farmers who have had their land pulled from them at the blink of an eye. And so trying to run a sustainable business or operation or garden is incredibly challenging if you don't, at a basic level, have that access to land and water. And so those are things that we're really actively working on and wanting to see continue to develop as our food system grows. The second piece is just, with the development of the local food system, making sure that growers are trained properly to be able to scale up and to be able to do what they do well, right? So whether that's FSMA, food safety certifications, this isn't the case for a huge number of urban producers, but for a few of them, right, the possibility of getting GAP certified and how that connects to the work that Rodger and others are doing with the good food purchasing policy and being able to sell to institutions because they have that GAP or good agricultural practices certification. At AUA, for the last couple of years, we've been working on a program called the Good Practices for Growing in Chicago program. And that program is really intended to train local producers on best practices, not just agricultural, but also business and marketing. We're going to be rolling out an online tool in the next month or so that's going to allow local businesses to assess kind of how they're doing in a variety of different categories to make sure that they're really meeting the standard that we're all trying to set for raising the bar for producers. So I think that training piece is really huge. And I know a number of organizations on this call are really actively doing that work to ensure that producers have the skills and the resources that they need to scale up. The final piece of that, I think, just envisioning a new and better food system is the capital and the infrastructure to be able to support increased demand. So many of our urban producers right now they don't have access to refrigeration. They don't have access to delivery vehicles. They don't have access to, a lot of folks have talked about wanting to see urban producers work together to collaborate to aggregate produce and, find ways to then send it to an institution or a wholesaler or whatever. But for most of those operations, there's not even the infrastructure to be able to do that aggregation. There are for a select few, but not for the majority. And so how do we, as as supporters, as advocates for this work, how do we ensure that these producers have the funding and all of the other, capital needs that come with building out that infrastructure and scaling up their operations? Particularly, I think it's important, and this is our work is really centered around supporting BIPOC owned and operated businesses. I think it's important that funding starts there, right? And supporting these producers who are directly contributing to healthy food access, environmental restoration in their communities. And so I think it has to start there and then move its way out. So like Liz mentioned, we have done some funding work this year. We had a farmer support grant where businesses were able to apply for small grants to be able to support themselves in the middle of the pandemic. And we're going to be continuing to find ways to support producers with that funding they need to scale up their operations and build out infrastructure and find new opportunities for collaboration, which I think is increasingly important. If we're going to make the urban agricultural food system work, we have to continue to find more ways to collaborate. And I know I've been really inspired by, I think in light of the pandemic, right, I've seen collaboration at an all-time high. I think we're working less and less in silos and we're working more and more together. And that's really how it should be. So I think that's my time. I'm going to pass it off. Well, pass it back to Elliot.
Thank you, Sean. Really appreciate it. And just for folks, heads up, I forgot to mention this at the beginning. If you have any questions for our presenters or anything, please feel free to put those in the group chat section on there. I saw we already had one for Sean, but we'll save that. We'll have a little Q&A at the end and we'll get back to that. So yeah, anything you want to pose, even if it's not to a specific person, just generally, just drop it in there and we'll throw it out to the group.
So Elliot, really quickly, so you'd like me to hold off on answering that? So we'll save that.
Yeah, we'll just get to it at the end. And even, if we go like a few minutes over, 1 o'clock, I don't think that's the end of the world or anything, but we'll try to get everything we can. Cool. So with that, our next presenter is Anton Seals. And Anton, I'll let you introduce yourself and you can take it away. Anton, I don't know if we can hear you right now. We'll give it just.
You guys hear me now?
Yep, we got you.
Okay. Well, so much for the technology the last couple days. So
right.
Try to prevent you guys from hearing the 7-year-old chaos that's happening in this house right now. But good afternoon, everybody. Anton Seals, Jr. Thank you, Jenny and IEC and everyone else for inviting us to share a little bit here. It has been quite a journey the last several months for small community-based organizations like Greater Englewood that was created by myself and now State Representative Sonia Harper as a response to the potential Whole Foods coming into the neighborhood and making sure that there was, Black presence in advocating for land and in this space around the food system or urban ag. It has so many food justice. And I got introduced into the system via policy. And so one of the big things that has been driving is been around, like, how do we set the stage for that? And during this most interesting time around dealing with some of the issues that are core around what we're talking about, So one, I just like to back up just in terms of language, because I think sometimes the language that we're speaking, we make a lot of assumptions that we're assuming the same things. And because I sit at an intersection of a lot of different circles, I think that the language is lost in translation a lot of times. In communities like Englewood, I think a lot of people have a understanding of a neighborhood or neighborhoods across the South Side or the Southlands, or what have you, particularly areas where Black people occupy, as places of desperation, places of, or what we often say is underserved, or, usually the focus is there. I think what the COVID-19, along with the, ongoing uprisings that are happening across our nation, speaks to a much deeper systemic issue around, the repair that has to happen, and the real desire for a new kind of contract for America. And I think in the food system in particular, it is the one space that I think that we have to come clean to really have these kind of deep conversations around some of the stuff that we talked about, which is land, which is the basis of a lot of this, and in particular around the fracturization of what's happened. I too, as Sean has mentioned, have seen, because we've been in triage mode, given the response, and it has been overwhelming. So if I'm missing components, it's because I've been pulled in like 1,000 different directions, because everyone right now seems to be attracted to food, number one, and supplying food, and which is a really good thing, because people are in need. But what it's also pointing out, early on, the mayor of Chicago created the racial equity rapid response team that I've been a part of with another organization that I kind of co-convened in South Shore, another neighborhood of the South Side. It's close to the lake. That was experienced a high morbidity rate with the virus. The top neighborhood in Chicago with the highest morbidity rate. And then the response to what would then happen in those upcoming weeks around testing and so forth. And food, of course, was at the center of it. And so one of the things that, this highlighted was that there were these glaring holes around, who was driving what, and everyone trying to get different particles out to constituents. And when we start talking about, and this is something I think all of us have struggled with in terms of local food or what that means to eat healthy, I think the theoretical part of it makes a lot of sense, but the practical parts of what that means for people in certain neighborhoods who struggle with, the levels or the impact of divestment, is that doesn't really matter, because it's more around survival mode. It's not just about, choice. But I also want to be really cautious to say that it's layered, that of course that's not the only part of the story. That in these communities that you also have people who are making choices. But I think that was happening, and then it was compounded by 3 weeks ago, the uprising around, the kind of racial injustice that we see systematically across, and particularly around policing issues, another area that I've worked in, and the call for the abolition of the defunding of policing, right? And people, being really hit, for those of us who are organized and activists have known about this language for years, but I think now in the lexicon of the broader public, it's like, what? Defund what? And so I think that's been a confrontation, but I think at the core of that is some of the solutions that people have been thinking about have been around funding more around food or food systems. How do you, make these communities even, more accessible? How do they even access food in a more accessible way? So those are some of the things that I think that have now brought the issues that we have been advocating for the last several years to the forefront. Even when we talk about communities that live in food deserts, which is actually how I got my start in this space. Was I worked for a member of Congress, and we helped do a lot of the lifting and codifying and bringing that language to, even though there was a much debate around, that framing of the conversation based on Danny Block's work at Chicago State at the time, around what we considered these kind of food deserts. But it's now been in our national lexicon since then. But one of the issues that that this wasn't going to just be a market-based solution only, and I think that's also still what we have an opportunity to create, is that it can't be the same kind of market-based solution practices only. And so part of the work that we've been doing that sometimes ruffles feathers is because, one of the things that in Chicago in particular was that where a lot of the urban landscape that is vacant is in our communities because it's been underdeveloped. And the city has not had a real clear commitment to, in furthering this in a real rapid kind of way. It's been several years since we've been working with a small group of farmers to get them onto the land, which, has been a real challenge around, in the pecking order, like, where does this make sense? Well, the silver lining in all this is that, COVID glaringly shows that this makes sense. But the other part of this is that you also have this separation between who the farmers are, right, in the system versus like who lives in those communities. So the racial component is there present. And instead of trying to skirt around it, I always put it on blast is first and foremost, because, I'm a representative of not the full body, but I'm hearing from residents around like where this land is going to be, and how it will be redeveloped. And so all of these things are being called into the public square right now around, the resources that many of these communities are, sorely lacking. After the uprising, whether you call it looting or retail liberation at some of the grocery stores, pointed out how vulnerable the system is that in many of these neighborhoods, like, that is the only store, that not even the local corner store exists in some of these communities in the last 20 years. So this landscape has shifted. So I think that there's just a tremendous opportunity in a lot of these communities, and they have to be led and supported. I think they have to be led by the people that are in those communities, number one. So that means that if we're really serious about, when we think about urban ag, there has to be some kind of translation of wealth to residents and people who are doing the work who don't have access in the same ways that a larger white context would have. And I think that's been a real challenge for many of us to bring up race. Usually it's the people of color who have to do that work, but it's really not, we're the victims of it. The victimizers or the larger society has to challenge it itself. And I think that's where this is going to be left off, is that these are blaring holes that were created that, someone's making these rules, someone's making these decisions on a regular basis. And so I think that is not separated from our urban ag system. And I think that the COVID-19, along with this uprising, has just changed the conversation to be that much bolder and that much on edge. And I think if done correctly through food, we can have and foster these kind of real, unpleasant truths, but also some ideas around, well, how do we move forward, as Americans, who share this space. And I think that is, you can break it down to, what Sean is some of the same things that GGE kind of works on, which is, land, ownership, having space, well, not even ownership, but we call it more stewardship around, but ownership in the sense that is turned over to community, that is community controlled. That there's supports for farmers in order to access. So, for the city of Chicago, it would be simply as a blueprint to lay it out in terms of like, how do you go from starting a community garden to actually being a farm business? Being really mindful of that there are different levers for different kinds of people and how they're entering into space and what they have available. And some of the more technical things in terms of access to water, access to the kind of technical support to be the kind of grower that would then produce something. But then there's another part of it, which is the larger community seeing value in that in itself. Because I think for all of us, when you are impoverished, what you are really, and not just impoverished, but adding a layer on, is that the level of convenience is what we're all fighting against. And so whatever we're selling in this space, it's really challenged against the convenience of that I could just run and grab something to eat as opposed to preparing it. And if that's not part of my day-to-day, in a larger context, I think within our communities, we have our own, there's communities within communities. There's a long-standing plant-based diet African-American community that stems out of, the Marcus Garvey era. You know what I mean? So they were from some of the forefronts in preparing plant-based foods. But that's a small part of a larger, so it's not impacting the health of this piece. And that's where I will close, is that the COVID-19 pandemic, and it has been points out I'm going to put in here the dashboard that was created by the city of Chicago, that's updated every week, and can provide you with the numbers of the COVID case. But what it pointed out for many of us is that diabetes, respiratory illnesses, and hypertension were like the candy for this virus. And being in a setting where you could not, move around, so congregate settings, so nursing homes. So our baby boomers at this point are the ones who are the victims of this virus. And unfortunately, I don't think that we're all the way done with it yet, because there's still not enough information around where the end is. So there seems to be a large dissonance that's happening in these communities around whether or not this is real or not, versus what we're seeing in terms of who the victims are, and that the victims usually have, chronic health related diseases that are based on diet and environment. And so I think that is still going to be our challenge across many urban spaces to address that, and particularly raising the voices from the people who live and work in these spaces. I think I ran over my time, but I think that's enough.
No, Anton, that's fantastic. I thank you so much for that perspective. Just as kind of a side note of one thing you had mentioned, I was at one of the Black Lives Matter protests here in Springfield, and was really encouraged to hear that one of the things that came up was about not just food access, but trying to promote people of color as like farmers in their communities and that kind of thing. And I think, this moment, as you said, with COVID-19 and the uprising surrounding George Floyd and the other injustices by our police departments, have really highlighted huge systemic problems, not just in government, but in our food systems and everything, and really appreciate your take on this. I'm glad that we've got a more diverse group, and I think it's something that we're all thinking about right now,
Yeah, I think we have to have these. I was hoping that we would have more of an engaging, I didn't know the format. I think it's something that we have to be able to really talk about these ideas, like how do we move forward? So it's not that these things are static. And I think that this is something that as our country, those of us who are middle-aged and younger are going to grapple with for many years now, in terms of how do we make this a more perfect union, is at the core question of how did we even get here? And so a lot of the work that, is happening and probably across this state right now usually wants to get to the kind of solution base, but not understanding what the real problems are, and holding that truth and who is going to be accountable for the manifestation of these problems, and what does that look like? So these are things that have just been collapsed in on themselves during this pandemic, because people are paying attention in ways that I think prior to, they just, you just were, it's not that we haven't been busy. It's just that now this is the attention.
Yeah, no. And I totally hear you. And as I was kind of saying a while ago, or at the beginning of the presentation, it's not that COVID-19 caused huge flaws in our food system. They have existed for years. And it's not like what happened with George Floyd is something new. It has happened for years. It just happens to be this moment that we're in, where all these things are coming to light. And it makes me very encouraged to have everybody on this call to talk about this stuff. It is very good. With that, I am going to get to a couple of questions on here that we have been asked to our presenters. Our first one was to Sean a little while ago. who was asking if he was linking any of the efforts for AUA outside of Chicago for places like Peoria, Bloomington, Springfield, Decatur, and East St. Louis. Sean, do you have any?
Yeah. So that's a great question. We don't really have, in terms of like programming or anything formal, there's no kind of formal partnerships that we have right now with other nearby urban areas. What I will say is that we're constantly in conversation with folks from other nearby urban communities, both within the state and the region, also like across the country. A big part of those conversations is trying to think through what have been successful models of supporting and allowing urban agriculture to thrive. And I think Chicago has no shortage of people who are energized and passionate about doing this work, and a lot of projects that are great. And I think now it's about how do we put these pieces together and kind of work together to make sure that we can establish a model that works for our city and that's equitable and justice oriented.
Oh yeah, appreciate that. Our next question, it looks like on here, is for Anton. Was it kind of asking if you had interacted at all with any health department officials in East St. Louis that have been working on this? I know I've been hearing anecdotally that they've been doing a lot of urban ag work, especially related to just local communities there. Have you spoken with them at all, Anton?
I have not. I have had the challenge of not having a duplicate machine. But I think that, and this is real, I think, in terms of like, being really transparent, having a small organization and trying to, do this kind of like non-direct service work, which was a lot of advocacy at the city level for, something that we kind of, a plan that was a shared plan that we worked with the city to execute and implement, has been way more challenging than we thought. Just because those people change, the administration changes. And it's not that it would be one thing if they just would say no. It's another thing when they say yes, and it's like a long yes, a long, 5 years yes, 6 years, so they don't really have a clue. And I think what they've seen in terms of urban ag, and I think this is where I think the promise of this will go, is because of this kind of public health crisis, is that public health and public safety are now seeing food in a different light that could be integrated into their approaches, and then their resources be deployed differently as well. So I'm encouraged by that. So I would be open to that. I think there's a lot of interesting dialogues that are happening around how public health could play a bigger role, how cities should play a bigger role, and being a catalytic conversion for the stuff that we've been working on. And part of that is making it a lot easier and removing a lot of the barriers that we've created.
Yeah. No, I appreciate that sentiment. IEC's been in some like kind of preliminary talks with some hospitals that have become really interested in food access and how that impacts public health. So I'm glad to see that folks are starting to kind of think about it from that angle, The next one we've got is for Liz Stelk. It says, I know this one is really complex and there are many factors, but what do you think is the biggest challenge in trying to create a more robust local food community? Is it climate change, funding, access to local foods? What do you think? I know that's a jumble. That's a lot.
Yeah, Teresa, thanks for that incredibly difficult question that I think everybody will have something to say about. But, I think the reality is, like, we're in a corn and bean state. All the support in this whole system, all the investments are for, and they're built around conventional agriculture, and specifically corn and grain and some, pork processing. Farms have changed. We've taken down fences. We've removed diversity. And like processing infrastructure across the state's really been mothballed over the generations. So anyways, the local food system is just like invisible. It's invisible to policymakers. We're often referred to as like, oh, how's your garden growing? So like, farm businesses are not really considered, serious. So that's a big part of the challenge that we're trying to bring to the table, is to, bring the visibility of local food producers and small, diverse producers, and then also begin to break down some of the barriers that they face, which are super practical, like local, like county public health regulations that are really aimed at super huge, risky food processing, and they're not at all scale appropriate. And I mean, we're seeing some good changes. Illinois Extension is growing, the small farm program, and ACES at U of I is transforming to, consider more than just like research on GMO corn. So there are promising signs, but I think, compared to other places, we're just really we're practically starting from scratch.
Yeah. Thank you, Liz, for expanding on that a little bit. We've got about 1 minute left. We can go through a couple more questions, I think, and then we'll get off. Sean, one question was in relation to the water access for community gardens. Do you guys have any specific policy proposals for the city or just generally that you guys would like to see kind of move forward?
Yeah, so we worked in collaboration with pretty much all the folks on this call to put together a series of policy proposals that we sent to the mayor's office. We've been in conversation with them over the last few weeks, and it looks like there's some positive movement on some of the things that we asked for. So we should hopefully have more to share pretty soon. Just to highlight, the biggest pieces of those asks were creating an urban farm permit rate. Right now, if you're an urban farm trying to access a hydrant, it costs you $83 a day per side of the hydrant to access water, which it just makes it like no urban farm can pay for that. So we're working on that right now. I think also, I don't want to get too in the weeds with this, but like looking at funding support for the installation and certification of RPZ or reduced pressure zone units, which are now a requirement, highly like a requirement across the board in cities and states. And so, community gardens this year have gone from having to pay, maybe $5 to $10 to access water from a hydrant now to somewhere between $2,500 to over $3,000. And so making sure that community gardeners can still grow and still provide food for their community, and have funding to support that.
Thank you, Sean.
I'll also just add, I can follow up. I can share a PDF with the list of things that we sent forward to the city to share out with this group afterwards.
That would be great. If you want to provide those with that, we can send it out to all of our registered folks and everything once we get the video up online. With that, it is 1:01 right now. I want to say personally thank you to all of our presenters, Liz, Rodger, Anton, and Sean. It was, I think the highest count I saw of people on today, we had 103 people on, which is the most we've had in a while. And I think it really highlights how much attention, our food system is getting right now, not just in relation to just the physical production of everything, but also its impacts on our most vulnerable communities. And it was really encouraging to see so many people here today that were interested in this. And hopefully, it starts conversations between some of our other groups and stuff too. And we just really appreciate everybody on this. So thank you guys. Thanks everybody that joined and listened. We will get this video up here in a couple days. So if you want to share it around, that would be awesome. And we look forward to talking to you guys more. So again, thank you to our presenters so much, and we will talk with you all soon.